And we know that statistically higher amounts of it were shown to also correlate with severity of endometriosis and progression of the disease in patients. So the higher the immune activity in the peritoneal fluid, the higher the progression of endometriosis is our summary. Now, a really useful and important supplement, if you're identifying this in some of your patients, is to look at the prescription of N-acetylcysteine or NAC. Now, NAC we know downregulates a number of different variables and reduces inflammatory cytokines as well. We know that it's a precursor to glutathione, which will also upregulate activity of natural killer cells and Treg cells. And we identified earlier that Treg cells were quite low in women with endometriosis. It also improves and assists in apoptosis, angiogenesis favorably, regulates self-proliferation, reduces production of hydrogen peroxide by reducing oxidative stress. Clearly, it's doing a lot of really, really wonderful things here. And NAC is one of those supplements that I think it's very dose dependent. It kind of seems like a broken record with me, though, because I think that dose is very much how you get any sort of benefit for any of your patients. And generally, if you're wanting to use NAC to have this immunological regulatory function, you're wanting to be prescribing patients roughly around a minimum of 1,500 milligrams per day. And NAC has separate functions to glutathione, and we will talk more about glutathione a little bit later. But if you listen to my other talk in this symposium, you will have heard quite a lot about glutathione and, things like mitochondrial health and things like that within cells. But NAC in its own right, it has a very different anti-inflammatory function to glutathione. And remember that whilst it's a precursor to glutathione, it has a whole host of other functions that it will achieve. Something that I always think of as well with N-acetylcysteine is that it's so effective at helping the lungs to clear themselves and to help to regenerate lung tissue and to get the cilia to move and to clear things out. I'll often use NAC if I'm wanting to get a cervical clearance, because the cilia in the cervix is very similar to the cilia in the lungs, and they behave very similarly when you're giving an agent that will act on the cilia. But similarly, I'll often use NAC if I'm having any tubal patency issues and I'm wanting to clear the fallopian tubes. And I do find that NAC can assist in that context as well. A really big dose of NAC before a Hechtman procedure can also improve the outcome and unblock those tubes too. Now, there was a really interesting observational cohort study of 145 endometriosis patients, and they found that 3 months of treatment with NAC, which was essentially 600 milligrams 3 times a day, 3 consecutive days a week, which means that 4 days a week they didn't even have it. So you can only imagine what would happen if they'd had it 7 days a week. It reduced the size of the cysts versus an increase in size in the untreated patients. So they were better than controls. They were better than all sorts of other aspects, but it was really important that the dose was achieved. And what was really interesting, that 24 of the NAC treated patients versus 1 within the controls were actually able to cancel the surgery because they were able to reduce the cyst size, or they were able to disappear them, and or pain reduction or pregnancy. So it was a really helpful and useful supplement. And it's a really good study and a good paper if you're wanting to really support the claims as to why you might want to prescribe it. But moving on, let's have a look at vitamin D. Now, vitamin D, there's lots of really, really interesting research looking at how and why it works. I do want to draw your attention to some of the vitamin D information that we spoke about in a previous talk as well, because I do want you to always make sure that you have a look at the various SNPs for women with endometriosis, because VDR, homozygosity and endometriosis kind of go hand in hand. So it's important to look at the SNP aspects, because I do think that when you look at the research around vitamin D with endometriosis and the ability to convert into, from a 25 OHD3 into a 125 OHD3, it definitely has a correlation with SNP propensity. And the general consensus is that women with endometriosis tend not to convert it very efficiently. So just have that in the back of your mind as we talk through the applicability of vitamin D and why we might want to prescribe it. So if we're looking at vitamin D, it's anti-proliferative, it's anti-inflammatory, and it is an amazing immunomodulatory agent. And I think it's important to remember the immune regulatory properties of vitamin D, and I think we often forget it. We tend to put vitamin D in the category of, the sunlight vitamin and being assisting with bone health and calcium regulation and all those other important things that it does do. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that vitamin D significantly reduces cytokine-mediated inflammatory responses. And we know endometriosis is an inflammatory condition now, and we've got that fairly well established, I would hope you'd agree. So vitamin D as a prescription is a good idea, but definitely check the SNPs and consider also the ethnicity of the person sitting in front of you, and really make sure that you understand the melanin production in their skin. So the higher the melanin, the higher the demand for vitamin D. And there are plenty of patients that I'll have on 5,000 international units a day long-term, because that's exactly what they essentially need. So the endometrium expresses vitamin D receptors and 1-alpha hydroxylase. So it's really important to acknowledge that if the vitamin D levels aren't right, vitamin D is one of those substances that will help to normalize that. And when we're thinking about that, we need to be thinking of that the endometrium will have so many receptors to vitamin D, which also means that vitamin D will regulate implantation. And there's lots of really good papers that can assist in confirming that for us and can provide some other useful information for us. So it's really interesting when you start to dive deep into that, and when we think about vitamin D as such an immune regulating hormone as well as a regulating nutrient. Now, the effects of vitamin D on endometriotic lesions, this is where, there was this beautiful paper in 2020, and they looked at all of the immunological compounds, the macrophages, the CD4s and the CD8 lymphocytes, the active vitamin D and where it worked on, and the endometrium and how that reduced the COX-2 expression and obviously the inflammation and prostaglandin levels. But the active vitamin D comes in here and is directly correlated to VDR. So that vitamin D receptor again. So it's really important to check the VDR receptor SNP status of all your endometriosis patients. If they are heterozygous or homozygous, and particularly homozygosity has a direct correlation with an inability to regulate the T helper 1 to T helper 2 conversion, an inability to reduce interferon, tumor necrosis factor, and all those other beautiful interleukins that are mentioned over there. So all of that immunomodulating role is directly correlated to the VDR status, and VDR status is also regulating all of that other anti-inflammatory function, and VDR is also regulating whether or not that vitamin D is absorbed and whether or not those immune cells can be populated appropriately and can normalize things. And I think we're all pretty comfortable now and confident with the concept that endometriosis has such a huge immune involvement that we have to make sure that we can normalize all of those variables.